Ginger Hardage. It is an honor to be with you. Welcome to the L3 Leadership Podcast. And I just want to start by actually diving into your career. You've had quite a career, and you worked for 25 years for Southwest. And you started off as the director of PR and worked your way up to where you were overseeing all of the marketing communications for the organization and reporting to the CEO. I'm just curious, can you kind of walk us through that journey? What was it about what you did that maybe set you apart for that career path that you were on?
Hey, Doug, great to be with you. I actually studied communications and advertising in college. So that was really, I was one of those lucky people that got to jump into my career field. So Southwest wasn't my first job. So I had worked in the field, honing those skills with communications primarily. And then when the opening came available at Southwest, I just was so anxious, but there was a moment there I was afraid I wasn't going to get it because I'd interviewed with the founder, Kelleher, and Colleen Barrett. And Colleen eventually became the president of the company. And it went great. I mean, we had a great conversation. I knew I'd nailed it. And then I didn't hear, I was sitting at my other job. And then one day I got a call from this guy, identified himself as the vice president of Southwest Airlines. And he said, I'm sitting here with the vice president of marketing and we're waiting on you for your 9 o'clock interview. And I just went, what? And then he started laughing. He said, we realized we didn't tell you about it. So, and he said, and we're in so much trouble because we've waited so long. So, wow. So that was my funny start to Southwest Airlines. But yes, I did start in communications. And then over time, like at any great organization, if you show an interest in something and have the capacity to add it to your team, that happened there. So continue to grow. We created an emergency response department. We added other departments along the way. Philanthropy came along, internal communications. So we ended up building a team of about 150 people focused on culture and communications.
Wow, that's incredible. And you got the privilege to lead that. I'm curious, can you talk to leaders who may be emerging leaders listening to this that say, hey, I'm starting out of the company. I'm not at that senior leadership level yet. I would love to get there one day. What are some things they can do that maybe you've did personally, or you've seen others who have rose through the ranks in the organization do that can set them apart?
Yeah, I think one of the basic things on performance is to over-deliver. Always look for whatever you can do on top of the assignment that you're working on. How can you over-deliver to really distinguish yourself or your team? How can you make the request or the assignment even better than what someone thought it might be? And then I'd also recommend focus on solving problems for the organization. So early on in my career, I might have done the assignment of producing a newsletter, for example. But over time, it was how do you solve the problems of the company? So another way to think of that is we need another type of publication following that along. So for example, we created something at Southwest that was called Read Before Lead. And it was a publication that we sent out, or an alert that we sent out just for leaders. Anytime there was a major change in the company, to help here's all the things you need to think about as a leader. So wow. Looking for things like that solved a problem for the organization. Look at your employee survey that you've got in your organization. What are employees needing differently? Look at how you could solve that problem. If you're in the marketing side, look at what customers are saying. What are their pain points? Look for the pain points in the organization. What are those pain points? What would make your product better? What would make your people perform better? What would make your customers happy? How are you solving those problems in your company?
Wow. And so solve problems and leaders will naturally notice you, which I would say that's absolutely true. And the more problems you can solve, the more leadership opportunities that you'll get. Absolutely. I love that. Speaking of leaders, great leaders, you got to work for two legendary leaders, and the founder, as you mentioned, and then Gary Kelly. Can you talk about your time under both of those leaders and maybe one or two lessons that you took away from both of their leadership styles?
Sure. And I'm going to throw another leader in at Southwest Airlines,
Yeah.
Colleen Barrett,
Okay.
who is President Emeritus of Southwest Airlines. But let's start with Herb Kelleher. Herb really taught all of us the power of relationships. He had an incredible capacity to remember people's names and certain things about them. And I learned the importance of relationships and really focusing on people. When you were talking to him, you felt like you were the only person in the room because he was talking to you. So the importance of really focusing on people. And then from Colleen Barrett, Colleen was the perfect balance with Herb because she made sure all the systems were in place. So such things as systems to make sure that customers always received a response from Southwest Airlines, even as the airline grew from a few thousand customers to, millions of customers a year. So she was really the diligence about the repetition of systems. And then from Gary Kelly, what I've really learned about is how to set up a leadership team. When Gary Kelly became CEO, we worked together as a leadership team. We set up how we wanted to interact with each other, how often we wanted to meet, our cadence of meetings, and how we wanted to disagree. And because, we can't all agree. So how are we going to debate issues? And the tone he set, he really is set such a respectful tone. And that made it so enjoyable for all the leadership team because we worked so closely together. And we decided we'd have lunch together every Tuesday. We weren't just talking about business, but we understood each other's lives and the importance of working together as a team.
Yeah, that's really, really fascinating. Can you dive into maybe some of the other habits and systems that you put together in place as a leadership team? You were talking about the boundaries, how you disagree. Anything there you think would be helpful for leaders? I think that's really fascinating.
Well, one of the things, if you've probably followed Pat Lencioni and his leadership books, so we worked with Pat as well. And we read all of his books, but worked directly with Pat as well on how to establish some of that rapport with our team. So one of the things we definitely we tried to really focus on one topic at a time. So if we had somebody coming in for 30 minutes to talk about something new we were going to provide on the aircraft, as an example, we would focus on that. But we had pre-reads where everyone had to be prepared for a meeting. So we came really prepared for our meetings. We also just always ask really respectful questions because you might be having someone really junior coming into the senior leadership team presenting, and you want to be respectful of them. They may never have done that before. So how are you helping them be successful in that environment? The other thing that Gary really did, he gave a lot of us opportunities. So along that lines of having people come into the organization, he would make sure that we had lots of junior people coming in who got exposure. We got to see them. But he also made sure that us as his executive team, we were always presenting to the board. And the board of directors had familiarity with us. And he also encouraged us to be involved in other outside boards as well, not just giving our time back to Southwest Airlines, but how we were influencing the world beyond that.
Wow. Well, what an opportunity for you. And I'm sure it was a huge blessing for them to get to work with you as a leader as well. I'm curious, just last thing on your career at Southwest before we start diving into culture. Is there anything else about your journey at Southwest that you wish people would know that maybe they don't know you haven't shared on other podcasts?
Southwest was really great at recognizing talent, and they didn't call it this, but I do, allowing freedom in a framework, where in all of our jobs, there's a basic framework, but Southwest excelled at letting you take it beyond those boundaries, and really looking at your personality and your strengths and allowing you to develop those strengths and have that freedom in a framework. So I came from a rural graduating class of 16 people.
Wow.
Small, right? So
Yeah.
I had my college degree, but I didn't have a great pedigree, right? I didn't go to an Ivy League school, and that Southwest, luckily, wasn't just looking for that.
Hmm.
They were looking for somebody who had a track record and and was willing to work hard. So I would encourage leaders not to just look at the pedigree or just look at the schools people have gone to. Really look at their track record, and Southwest was great about that. So people literally, you've heard the story about starting in the mailroom. We had one of our vice presidents started in the mailroom,
Wow.
and he went all the way up, worked his way up because he truly was an outstanding leader.
What a story. I love that. And so obviously you had a phenomenal career at Southwest, but then in 2016, you actually jumped out and started your own company called Unstoppable Cultures, which is what you do today. I certainly want you to talk about what you do through that, but talk about that transition. I mean, it seems like you were in a pretty comfortable place, a lot of recognition, huge staff, a lot of exciting things to be a part of. Talk about that journey. Was that a big risk? Was it scary? What was that like?
Well, it's something I contemplated for a long time, and there was a period of time, quite a period of time, where my CEO knew that that's what I would be doing. My parents were in their 90s and lived several hours away, and it was getting harder for me to be able to really be there for them. So that was a primary consideration for me, wanting to have that flexibility. The demands of a job in an airline is 24/7, and I needed to break away to be able to focus on them. And I'll never get that time back, and I never regretted taking that turn. But at the same time, I had the team was in place at Southwest Airlines. The bench was there,
Hmm.
great leaders in culture, great leaders in communication. So it afforded me that opportunity to step away because the leadership was in place. So I took a little pause, and then decided I'd learned so much at Southwest Airlines. I had been blessed with so many experiences that I wanted to go through more doors, share that with more companies. So I primarily am do keynote speaking. That's my primary focus. I also do some consulting, but also I have a master class in culture called the Fellowship that really helps other organizations develop the culture that they want in their companies. And no cultures are cookie cutter. They're all so different, and it's so important that you really know what an organization is trying to achieve. They shouldn't try to pattern after Southwest Airlines or Chick-fil-A or
Hmm.
any of those iconic cultures. They can learn some of the lessons, but they need to focus on what their own behaviors and values in their organization should be.
Wow. And we'll dive into that in a second. More on the transition. I love how you said you had a deep bench in place. You'd been communicating what you wanted to do for some time. Obviously, family was a big part.
Privately to my boss.
Yes,
I didn't want
privately.
my team to know.
Any advice for leaders? There may be leaders listening to this that are in that season that have a dream, but uh, how can leaders transition well? How did you build that deep bench? Was it difficult? Any other advice for transitioning leaders?
No, that's one of the key things to look at in your organization is really how are you building that bench, and not just the next bench, not just the next generation, but the generation below that. So if there's anything we worked on hard at Southwest, it was a lot of mentoring and a lot of development. I just saw one of my team members from years ago just completed the high potential class for Southwest Airlines. He posted on social media. So I know that's still happening. That continue to develop the various decades of talent that they have, and really focusing on bringing those people up. So it's just like one of the things I mentioned earlier. How are you getting your talent on your team in front of other leaders in the organization? If they need presentation skills, what kind of courses are you sending them to? It's just really realizing as a leader, your key responsibility is to develop those people in your organization so that they can do great things in your organization, or they may go on to other organizations. One of the things we saw a lot of, not a lot of, occasionally we would see it, would be when somebody would leave the organization, they would boomerang. They would decide to come back.
Wow, that's great.
And
Yeah.
That's one of the things I talk to organizations now about is how are you handling farewell? So what does farewell look like? Because oftentimes people decide they do want to come back, and they bring other experience back to the organization when they come back, and a lot more experience.
Yeah, that's so good. And I'm assuming one of the main reasons that they came back was the culture you created. And I think this subject is so pivotal right now in the age that we're living in. We're in the middle of what people are calling the Great Resignation, and people have options. They realize that they can go to any company, well, pretty much any company. They can work remotely. But it seems like what really can set an organization apart and cause them to retain and attract new employees is their culture, which is what you focus on. And so in today's era, I'm just curious, how does focusing on culture help an organization during the times we're living in?
Right. Well, now there's so much uncertainty, right, in our world, and trying to really provide that type of stability in our organizations. How are we doing that consistency, so people know what to expect from their leaders and know what to expect from their organization? And culture is all about the behaviors that we're showing as an organization. So if we're trying to muster through this difficult time, or we're trying to really change our organizations because of the effect of the economy or the pandemic, the only way we can do that is focusing on the behaviors of our people, and how are we setting them, how are we letting them know those expectations, and how are we training them and supporting them so they can deliver in the best way for our organizations.
Yeah, and talk to leaders. I am curious on this. So you worked for 3 significant leaders at Southwest. Southwest is known for their culture. Have you found that Southwest's culture stayed consistent under all 3 leaders, or have you found when a new leader comes in, based on who that person is, maybe some of the values stay the same, but the culture shifts based on that leader? What would you say? It's kind of like what came first, the chicken or the egg? What came first, the leader or the culture? I'm just curious your input.
Yeah, very often organizations, there are key times when organizations' culture is probably going to change somewhat under a new leader or in times of crisis. And definitely a lot of organizations have been going through crisis from an economic standpoint or the pandemic standpoint. So there are changes. So I'll talk about a major hospital network that I've recently worked with. They realized under a new CEO wanted to have a new focus, a new value that dealt with impact. And so they really are focusing on leaning into this new value. It's something they're already doing, and that's the important thing about our values in our organization. They could already point to how their employees were doing that already, having an impact individually on their patients, but they really wanted to emphasize that. How are you as an individual in the healthcare organization having an impact on the patients? So that's an example of when a CEO might bring in something new for the organization to really focus on. It's something they're already doing, but how are we adding a focus to that?
Okay, and can you talk to leaders? We'll just pretend a leader starting from scratch. If a leader really wanted to start shaping their culture and creating a strong culture, where would you encourage them to start?
Well, I'd start with looking at what are the values of their organization. Most organizations already have articulated those values, and I would just make sure as a leadership team that they're fully aligned upon that, because nothing can turn an organization toxic faster than leaders not living those values. So if you have a value that you're not holding people accountable for, the organization's going to see that, they can feel that. And if you see a leader not being, let's say, displaying integrity, for example, then how in the world, if as a leader's not displaying integrity or respect back for individuals, whatever that value might be, you probably need to revisit those values, or you need to make sure that that executive has an opportunity to make a correction, or they may no longer need to be with the organization. Because we allow bad behavior, it's going to be noticed and perpetuated in the organization. So I would align those values, and then get a lot of employee involvement on describing the behaviors that are going to display those particular values. So, for example, one of the values at Southwest Airlines was to have a servant's heart. So the company was looking for people who wanted to serve others. And you see that every day if you are out there at Southwest Airlines on the aircraft. The flight attendants are doing their best to make you comfortable. They might tell a joke or something, so you're relaxed. So in every aspect of every job, have those particular behaviors that would really show what that value looks like in the company. Another one of the values was warrior spirit, which means persevere, work hard. So if you think of somebody loading the luggage, they're working hard. They might be out in the snow in the winter. They might be in Phoenix. They're in 100-degree heat, right? In the summer. So how is that warrior spirit being displayed in every aspect of every employee's job? So take your values, have your employees help you describe those behaviors.
Yeah, and it sounds like on the accountability side, holding people accountable to living out those values. If they're not, it sounds like, the first step is coaching to hold them accountable. And if that's not working, it sounds like it can actually get into serious, issue documentation and ultimately leading to them not be there. And then you mentioned, stories of people where people are living out the values. What are some ways that Southwest has recognized and celebrated, those employees living out the culture?
Yeah, so culture isn't a faucet you can turn on and off, and those values aren't something that you can stop talking about. So I encourage companies at every point of the employee journey, how are you reinforcing those values? So if you look at an employee journey, all cultures start before hiring. So they're starting back, they're people, how they're looking at your LinkedIn, how they're looking at Glassdoor, how they see you showing up online, and how you talk about your employees. So all of our cultures start before hiring. And then when we get in that hiring process, how are we involving as many people who do that job as possible to help select those people? And then onboarding, in terms of onboarding, how are we making sure that first day is so memorable? And then in the recognition, we could talk for an hour on recognition alone, I'm sure. But recognition, how are we gathering those customer stories? How are we doing peer-to-peer recognition? And how are we making sure that the best of the best stories are elevated in our organizations? So I can talk about how Southwest did that.
Yeah, I would love to. I work at a nonprofit, and we serve the homeless, and so we're always looking to collect stories. So, system wise, I am curious, of how many thousands of employees you all had. How did you systematically collect those stories and communicate them?
Yeah, and when I work with organizations, that the system of collecting those stories is one of the things they struggle with.
Yes. Help me, Ginger. Yes.
So I know we all do, right? So really looking at if calls came into our reservation system, for example, and it mentioned an employee, congratulated an employee, that went into a special queue so that employee would know what the customer said about them, and they would be recognized. Same thing with email. Any recognition went to a special queue so that all of that types of recognition would be tracked. And then very aggressively tracking social media, because they may just, a customer may just be putting their news out on social media. So how as an organization are we capturing all of that on social media tracking it, cataloging it, and making sure that the employee gets that type of recognition. So many organizations have robust systems and practices for tracking all of that and making sure that the best of the best stories get retold as well. So how are we retelling those legendary stories that our employees do, and how are we using our social media to retell those stories?
That's so good. You mentioned, culture starts from before people even start the interview process. But one thing you mentioned was making sure that people's first day is as memorable as possible. Is there anything specific that you guys did to make people's first day memorable? That just sparked my curiosity.
Yeah, I encourage you guys to Google that. Just do Southwest Airlines onboarding, and you will see something that looks a lot like a pep rally. So employees are literally, all employees come to Southwest early on for training. So when they show up on Monday morning, there literally is a red carpet and pom-poms and cheering, and they get saluted on that very first day, and the training and celebration of them starts right there. So how are we making that so memorable that first day? And because we never forget it. We never forget those early moments in our organizations.
Yeah, and talking more about culture too, you talked about a strong culture. Obviously, Southwest is known for their culture. How can leaders actually measure the culture of their organization? Is it a feeling? Is it something that you can tangibly get data on? What advice do you have for that?
Yeah, well, it can be a feeling, absolutely, but it also is data. But when you walk into an organization, you can feel what the culture is like. When you walk into, say, one of your healthcare professionals, what does it feel like when you go into their office? What is the receptionist, which I call the vice president of first impressions, right? The receptionist, how welcoming is that when you go into an environment, how important that is. So yeah, we can feel it. When I walk into Trader Joe's, I know I'm in a different kind of grocery store because they're probably going to approach me and see, do you need help with something? And they're going to go out of their way to help me in their environment. So you can feel it, but you can measure it. So one of the things we do is really look at employee surveys and what are the kinds of questions we're asking in our employee surveys. A great question for that is similar to Net Promoter Score that many people use in their marketing efforts. And the question is, how likely would you be to refer this product, refer this company to someone else? So that's a Net Promoter Score. You can ask employees, how likely would you be to suggest someone work here? Well, if they're not very likely to suggest someone work in the organization, their view of the organization is pretty low. So that's one of the questions. One of my favorite questions is, how do you view your job at the organization? Is it a job? Is it a stepping stone in your career, or is it a calling? And organizations that have tapped into making sure that their employees feel like their job is a calling, that they have the kind of freedom to really deliver their job, and they see the connection between their individual contributions as an employee and the big picture of the organization. They're contributing to something bigger than themselves. They see it as a calling. And I think that's an incredible question to be able to measure within your organizations. So there are lots of ways, but there's a few of them.
Yeah, and I'm just curious, did you develop that survey from internally, or did you use an external company to come in and conduct those for you?
Both. When we started out, we had some of, decades ago, we had some of our own questions, but we, through the years, worked with experts and experts. But Southwest now, of course, does it. I'm not sure exactly what they're doing today, but I know that they are aggressively surveying their employees. The trend definitely is to ask fewer questions more often, because our
Mm.
companies are changing so quickly. You know, the time when you do that big annual survey, you probably can't wait a year to tap into
Wow.
what's going on with your employees. So more organizations are doing surveying, smaller surveys and more frequent to be able to keep up with the pulse of the organization.
Yeah, that's really insightful. We started engaging in an organization called BCWI, Best Christian Workplace Institute, and they would do annual surveys. We still use them. They do annual
Yes.
surveys, and they've been phenomenal. The feedback that you actually get from those that you can actually do stuff with is incredible. But like you said, it is so fast paced that a year goes by like that. Yeah, that's really, really interesting. So thank you for sharing that. So let's say you're a leader, and I doubt this ever happened in Southwest, but all of a sudden you start getting feedback, a feeling, and through data that your culture is terrible and it needs fixed. Where would you even start to turn around a bad culture, a toxic culture?
Well, more than likely, it might be a pocket of the organization.
Mm,
Generally, that's one of the things you might be seeing. So I would do focus groups with those employees to dive deeper into it, and have a very aggressive action program to acting on what you're hearing. It might be they're overworked, they're understaffed. Um, get to the root cause and how are you addressing it as an organization. That's definitely one of the things a lot of companies are hearing is people are feeling overworked because so many people are leaving our organizations. People can't keep up with the staffing and hiring. So it
mm.
puts a lot of pressure on those employees who do stay. And how are we taking care of them? And how are we showing them that we're trying to quickly bring people back into the organization? The other thing I'm seeing is organizations are allowing much faster decision making because they're needing to get more people into the organization. So letting recruiters make direct offers when they find
Wow.
the right kind of employee, as opposed to having it go back to a committee or something that might take 2 weeks and you might lose that employee in that time period. So empowering recruiters to make offers on the spot.
Yeah, it's so interesting in the culture we're living in because a lot of times it's like, hire slow, fire fast has been the motto. I don't know if there's enough data on this because it's just starting to happen, but do you feel like the end result of hiring quickly is the same as hiring slowly from before? Do you have any thoughts into
Well,
that?
I think it's always great as many people. So it may be more like speed dating, right? Let's think of it that way. You're
Yeah.
just going to expose them to quite a few people in a shorter period of time. So it puts a lot more pressure on the organization to be really organized in how they go about the hiring, how many people might have a touch point with that employee in a short amount of time, to do that kind of in-depth interviewing. And again, I mentioned this earlier, but making sure you have people who actually do the job as part of your interview panel as well.
I want to transition and talk about communication, but before we do, anything else that you would share with leaders when it comes to culture or how you can help them with their cultures?
Again, I would look at your values, look at your employee journey, and how are you reinforcing those values at key moments within that employee journey, and how often do your values show up in storytelling. That's one thing you and I didn't talk about, but storytelling. How are we really taking those stories of something that an employee's done and help other employees see the limitless boundaries they can go to try to serve our internal customers or our external customers. So using storytelling to bring our culture to life, to show people what it looks like, and to reinforce those lessons.
And storytelling is obviously a form of communication. And you hear it all the time. I know you've been on Andy Stanley's podcast. He has that famous quote, "The vision leaks," and you need to, keep repeating, keep repeating. You were in charge of all communications, and I'm just curious, as you've worked with CEO and leaders, what advice would you give leaders on communication? Their cadence of communication, how often? Because I'm sure that they think they need to be communicating way less than they actually do.
Bingo. That is universally true. Leaders, think, well, I, you know, recently I spoke with a CEO of a firm I won't name, and a national firm. And I asked him how often he was communicating. He said, "Oh gosh, I have a monthly." And I'm like, I was just okay. I didn't want to shut down the conversation right there, but I'm going, whoa, we got to speed this up.
Wow.
So, for example, Gary Kelly had, when he became CEO in 2004, he started a weekly communication to employees. And back then in 2004, we had flip phones. So he recorded a message to employees so they could hear his voice, because he had been with Southwest Airlines, but he was new as the CEO. So they could hear his voice, and they could listen to it. And over time, that evolved into, he still recorded it. You could still hear his voice, but you could dial in on the internet. You could read it on the internet. But the consistency of that, he did that every week from 2004 to 2022, when he retired earlier this year. So that is the kind of consistent communication commitment that is unbelievable. And those communications always ended, every one of his communications ended with some sort of thank you or shout out. And it was usually a story about an employee, something an employee had done or something a department had done, and thanking them. So that, that hits on a lot of leader tenets right there: consistency, high level of frequency on communication, and again, modeling and talking about the kind of behavior that we're all looking for.
And as far as the content you mentioned, specifically with Gary, but I'm sure it was the same with all the leaders, they had leadership teams around them. How did he put together the content? Was it just, hey, Gary, you need to have a values lesson? Or was it you as the communication lead to feeding him stories and putting that together? What did that process look like?
Yeah. And it depends on the size of your organization. We had I think Southwest now has 60,000 employees. So you need quite an infrastructure, obviously, to keep that going. We were lucky that we had communications people assigned to each of the major divisions, so they could assist those leaders in writing those communications. So, or in your organization, you might have 100 employees. So as the leader, who can you work with to develop those communications? So I believe culture, leadership, and communication go hand in hand. And I'm very partial to making sure you have a strong communications person helping guide you in that process. And we have to look at all the various channels. We know, we're kidding ourselves if we think our employees are getting up every morning and the first thing they're doing is looking on our intranet. No, they're looking at Instagram, they're looking at Facebook, right? We know that. So we've got to be on Instagram and Facebook as organizations. So I look here, a leader that I admire is the CEO of McDonald's Corporation. And so I look at his LinkedIn, Chris Kinchinsky, and look at what Chris is doing on LinkedIn. Look at what he's doing on his Instagram. How are leaders that you admire? How are they showing up? Not only are they talking to their employees, but they're also talking to their customers on those major communication lines.
That's so good. I want to dive into, we have a few minutes left, what I call the lightning round. So thank you for all the great content on communications and culture. Fantastic. And your career. And the first one is, what is the best advice you've ever received and who gave it to you?
Well, Doug, I thought about that. I thought you might ask that question because that's usually a podcast question. And for me, it wasn't hearing them or having a leader that was great at quoting advice. It was watching them. And so I think we learn more from watching our leaders than we do from hearing our leaders always. So I really did watch and admired the behaviors of so many of my leaders about how they would listen to people, how they would not try to answer try to speak for them, try to truly understand what people were struggling with, and offering that kind of support. So looking at our actions and how people interact and the relationships they have with other people.
If you could put a quote on a billboard for everyone to read, what would it say?
Oh, don't compare. Everyone is
Ooh.
on a different journey.
That's
We're
good.
all on a different journey, and we have to be authentically ourselves to be authentically happy.
You've got an opportunity through what you do to hang out with a ton of incredible leaders. And I'm always looking for great questions. I'm curious, when you get to have lunch or coffee with a great leader, do you have a go-to question or two that you always ask in those times together?
Well, you might ask them what the hallmark of their leadership is. And it would either be, that and those kind of, I think those answers can be really interesting. What is the hallmark of their leadership? You probably would hear a lot about mentoring and listening.
So usually what I do for this question is whatever you ask is what I'm going to ask you. So I would ask you, Ginger, what is the hallmark of your leadership?
Oh, I hope it was mentoring and listening. I really do. Mentoring was very important to me, just because what an opportunity if you're able to help someone achieve something greater than they ever thought possible, and helping put them and giving them the confidence and the courage to step up and be an incredible leader. So how we mentor others.
Yeah, and just out of curiosity, as you did that, was that more you mentoring, the people that came under you organizationally, or did you find other ways to intentionally mentor leaders throughout your organization or externally outside of your organization?
All of those.
Okay.
I had a mentoring call this morning.
Oh, wow.
With someone who's trying to decide, do they need to change their job? And so, yeah, as leaders, that we've probably seen a lot of different scenarios, and a lot of times if you just listen to someone, they may not realize they already have the answer, but if you're really listening to them, you're probably going to pick up that they already have the answer to what they're asking you about. In the case with this person today, I could hear that they were already made the decision to leave. So, and just encouraging their heart to continue to move in that direction.
Wonderful. What's your biggest leadership pet peeve?
Oh, leaders that don't want to spend time with their people. And you probably think that's crazy, but I've seen it a lot. And leaders not realizing the importance of being out face to face. So I encourage leaders to look at their calendars. How much of their time are they really giving back to their employees? How much of the time are they spending in front of their employees? So if they're not, mark a few, whatever time during your day. If you have an energy slump during your day, at 2:00, you feel like, oh, I'm getting tired and need a cup of coffee. Stand up instead and go visit with some of your employees. Surprise them greet them for when they walk in the door every day. Do something unusual to try to really interact with your employees.
That's so good. Speaking of unusual, do you have any unusual habits that have enabled you to be successful in your life and career?
Oh, I have a lot of weird ones, I'm sure. One of the things I've realized about myself is get as much done early in the day as possible. And the other one is, of course, we all have electronic lists that forever keep us organized. But I've started making a daily list. I do it the night before. So I do a written list. I know that sounds old fashioned, but I hate, I hate. So if that written list isn't, I don't want to have to rewrite that on tomorrow's list. Right. So really keeping a written list is old school, but it works for me.
Yeah, and if you could go back and have coffee with Ginger at any age in your life where you could have said something to that version of Ginger that would have made a difference, what age would that be and what would you have said?
Wow. I think age 22 is a real transition point for a lot of people because we're coming out of college and we're starting our careers. So if I could go back to that 22-year-old, I would say, boy, you are doing a great job of listening to your heart about where you
Wow.
would and would not fit in, what types of organizations you would not fit in, and continue to do that for the rest of your career.
Wow.
But really listening to your heart about if you know something's not quite right and wouldn't be a good fit in an organization, having the courage to keep going and until you do find that right fit for you.
Anything else you want to leave leaders with today?
Well, I encourage, I just salute the leaders. Leadership is it's a lonely place sometimes, and leaders cast a long shadow. So I salute you, knowing that you're casting a long shadow, and may you be touching a lot of people and making a difference in lives that maybe 20 years down the road you'll hear back that feedback. Maybe you won't, but if you're lucky enough to get that feedback that you really made a difference in someone's life and you made it better.
Well, Ginger, this has been a fantastic interview. Thank you for your time. Thank you for adding value to me and all of our listeners, and hopefully we'll get to do this again sometime.
Thank you, Doug. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you for your leadership.
My pleasure.